Hello and welcome to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. Today we're going to look at Russia's hybrid war against Europe, a mixture of targeted assassinations, sabotage, drone incursions, cyber attacks, disinformation and election manipulation, to mention but a few. This covert war began long before President Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. For example, way back 20 years ago, Russian agents used radioactive polonium to poison Alexander Litvinenko, a defector from the Russian security service who had denounced a mafia state under Putin. Likewise, a bungled attempt to murder a former double agent, Sergei Skripal, using the Novichok nerve agent in Britain in 2019, triggered a mass expulsion of suspected Russian spies across Europe. But those incidents were more a type of classical undercover warfare between secret services than the much broader attacks on Western societies unleashed since 2022. So what are Russia's objectives, and how is it trying to achieve them? How well prepared and effective are European societies in responding to this type of warfare? What new trends do we see in Russian actions and targets and in European responses? And what role is China playing in Russia's hybrid campaign? Last year, hardly a week went by without news headlines about hybrid attacks, from the sabotaging of undersea telecommunications and energy cables and pipelines to exploding parcels in cargo shipments, drone overflights over European airports and military bases, cyber attacks on hospitals, media outlets, and public service websites. Since the start of this year, fewer such attacks have been reported. Now, have Russian tactics changed, or is it just that other major news has crowded the hybrid war out of the headlines? With me to discuss these questions and to explore the situation on this often invisible front are Hanna Linderstal, a Swedish business security consultant specialized in cyber protection and recovery, and Chris Kremidas Courtney, my fellow senior visiting fellow at the EPC, who's a leading global expert on hybrid threats, including a stint at the Hybrid Center of Excellence at NATO and for the US government. Welcome to both of you. Hanna, let me start with you. What new trends do you see in Russia's hybrid warfare? Do you share my impression that things have gone quieter this year, perhaps because certain tactics were proving counterproductive or uniting rather than dividing Europeans? Or is it just that fewer of these attacks are being reported because of other dramatic news?
Thank you, Paul. I do agree there's a bit of reporting fatigue, but that's because of other crises. I think media can focus on one thing at a time. Sometimes it feels like that. And it's been a lot of reporting about incidents. But we do have reports, especially in Sweden, regarding Russian hybrid attacks. We have a lot of reporting regarding the Russian shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea, who has a very known presence. And just these last 2 weeks, we have two incidents where the Swedish Coast Guard had boarded ships that are sailing under non-flag or false flag in the Baltic Sea. So we do have a lot of incidents. We have the systematic cyber attacks towards both public sector and private sector. We have incidents in form of espionage and sabotage on Swedish soil. But I'm a bit afraid that we have reached a situation where the media have a bit of a reporting fatigue, because it feels like they are reporting the same thing over and over again. And I do see a lack of engagement and acknowledgement of all these small incidents, because hybrid warfare are several small incidents at the same time. They don't come in with a flag or a membership behind it. It just happens in society. And it worries me that a lot of them are being discounted as just accidents, coincidence, or with some other explanation, and are being missed out. So we don't have a really good situational awareness at the moment. And as you mentioned, China as we know, are really, really competent when it comes to digital espionage. And I had a speech just recently where I said that China probably have a better situational awareness of what's going on in Sweden than the Swedish government ever will have, because we have a lot of data leaking everywhere. We have systems that we don't know where the data is stored, how it's stored, and how to gain access and control over the information. So there's several things going on.
Now, your home country, Sweden, was a particular target for Russian attacks, wasn't it, when it announced plans to join NATO after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? What happened then, and is it still going on now? Is there a particular thing about Swedish membership of NATO that is drawing hybrid attacks, or is it just part of the general pattern that we see all over Europe, for example, the shadow fleet, as you mentioned?
Well, Russia was very clear when Sweden joined NATO that they don't like this. They think it's not in their interest for Sweden to be part of NATO, and advised against it clearly. And we see the activities with the shadow fleet because that's very easy to acknowledge for us. We see the ships, they are just outside of the Swedish waters, and sometimes they go in over Swedish waters. They love to stand over our infrastructure, our internet cables under the Baltic Sea, just to be there. And it's intimidating and scary. And we have had incidents of sabotage towards the infrastructure. So I would say it has not loosened up anything. I think it has increased. I think the cyber attack has increased. And I meet a lot of management, both in the public and private sector, and sometimes they say, well, we don't feel that we are so targeted at the moment. And I usually tell them that you have really, really good IT departments, but they are really poor on internal reporting. So they are really good on handling the threat, but they don't tell you about it.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you how the Swedish public authorities, business and civil society have been dealing with the attacks. What's been their impact on public opinion? I mean, do people get intimidated, or on the contrary, does it tend to unite Swedes behind their country's security policy and the choice of joining NATO?
I believe that the engagement in preparedness development in Sweden has increased a lot. We had a big conference with focus on cyber threat this autumn together with the preparedness authorities in Sweden who are helping civil society. The theme was action. The large security conference in the north of Sweden that we have every year, and this year was for the 80th year in a row, called Folk och Försvar, had the theme for this year, action. We need to take action, not only talk about the threat, we actually need to do things. We need to be prepared. And I believe that this has followed through in society. So people are looking into, okay, what can I do? If this increase, what am I supposed to do? How do I protect my business? And it's not only cyber, this is actually preparing for war.
Yes, indeed. Well, Chris, let me turn to you. How effective do you think Russia's disinformation and election manipulation campaigns have been? What have we learned in combating them? And what have the Russians learned in making them more effective? Or have they moved on to new objectives?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Hanna. It's great to join you. I think when it comes to how effective the Russians have been, I mean, it's a patchwork across Europe, depending on the culture and language and wherever there's an existing cultural affinity. I think you're going to see a map with different levels, northern, southern, eastern, and Western Europe. I think what we see with the Russians is they've changed their approach. So, they used to have a very centralized approach. The RT channel was on all of our television sets in Europe. We had a number of centralized actors that could broadcast. You had a lot of decentralized actors. Well, now RT's been banned, Sputnik's been banned in most of our countries. Some of the open systems like that are no longer available. And so they've had to go to a more decentralized approach. And I can talk about that in a moment. But I think what Europe has learned with each of these steps, because Europe has been taking a number of steps, positive steps. And the first one is that Europe is no longer playing whack-a-mole. We're no longer chasing individual messages and whatnot. That is mostly carried by civil society organizations. And I'll talk a little more about them later. But I think what Europe has learned is that it's about the ecosystem, the covert financing, the proxies that are being used, the cyber activity and sabotage that sort of, it's all part of a larger campaign, and how the narrative reinforces that. So the Russians, it looks like what they're doing now is they decentralize. They have more localized actors. You don't have so many big central accounts. You have more hundreds of accounts, often AI-enabled accounts that are or disposable actors on cyber actors online who can spread information on behalf of Russia. And they're all, they're doing the same thing with sabotage. They have more decentralized. You don't see GRU agents going and doing it. You have local hires. Hey, here's an envelope with some money. Can you go and here's some explosive. Can you do something about that rail line that's carrying things into Ukraine? So I think for Russia, going more decentralized. The other thing I think when you ask how they've changed their approach, I think they're still aiming at dirtying up politics, making democracy feel dirty, turning people off on politics. In the last couple of years, the real big difference I see is they seem more focused now on breaking European unity, in particular on support for Ukraine, not only through influence operations, but those sabotage operations I just mentioned. I think the biggest thing I've seen is that we have learned a lot more about protecting our elections. So we're better now at protecting our elections than we are at protecting European unity. And I think that needs to change because for Russia, I think they keenly see that dividing Europe is the key for them to have any hopes of prevailing in the war against Ukraine.
Well, we'll come on to that. It's interesting to say, to look at, what are we putting the right policies in place to combat what they're up to? But first of all, let's talk a little bit more about China. What role is China playing in these disinformation and sabotage campaigns? What evidence is there, if any, of coordination between the two?
I'm glad you brought up China because it's easy to see Russia here in Europe. We see them clearly. But China is definitely part of the hybrid picture here in Europe. Russia is obviously the more aggressive actor. There's a lot more of the activity we've seen. But we've also seen China actively involved in everything from spreading information on the floods in Valencia. That was their Spamouflage campaign. There's a civil society organization in Madrid that did fantastic work at tracking that and monitoring that. Cyber attacks on European governments. We even have Chinese vessels. Let's not forget, there were Chinese vessels dragging anchors across cables in the Baltic Sea. Also, a new report I just put out today over at the Euro-Atlantic Resilience Center on the spike in Chinese tourists at various NATO and EU countries conducting reconnaissance of military facilities. I mean, like hundreds of them out flying drones over our sites and whatnot, taking pictures. So we're seeing a lot more of that activity. It's always the big question. Are they coordinating? To what degree? Is there evidence of that? I look at what the Estonian intelligence said in their new public report, which is a great read if you haven't seen it. Estonian intelligence calls them allies without a treaty. And there doesn't appear to be evidence of a combined strategy, but there's a lot of proof of functional alignment. So they have shared narratives. They mutually amplify each other's messages. We see political intermediaries, especially here in Europe and in Belgium and Germany, some publicly reported cases of that, and parallel pressure on democratic institutions. So I think the evidence is strongest at the level of synchronized narratives, overlapping ecosystems. But we've also, let's not forget, we've seen Russian vessels loitering around undersea cables outside of Taiwan during a time when the Chinese were threatening or cutting their cables. We've also seen shared news outlets in Europe. Let's just take German-speaking Europe, for example. There's a site called Zuerst, which is used by both Russian and Chinese disinformation actors. So I think what we're seeing is a de facto hybrid partnership where Moscow and Beijing, they increasingly benefit from each other's pressures being put on our democratic countries.
Oh, that's really interesting. Let's take a look at a couple of countries in more detail. Tell us about how Russia's tried to influence politics and elections in Moldova last year and Hungary's crucial election next month. How does Moscow adapt its tactics depending on whether it's trying to unseat a pro-Western government in Moldova or to try and keep in office a pro-Russian government in Hungary?
Well, Russia threw the whole playbook at Chisinau this last year, and they spent over $150 million on propaganda, disinformation, smear campaigns, the works. They even were training violent groups to go and launch provocations in voting areas, and they failed. And the reason they failed was because the Moldovan government, they acted decisively from a law enforcement and an executive perspective. So they had law enforcement, they basically saw that if you follow the money and stop the flow of illicit funding and follow who it goes to and interdict that, you can save your election. And that's exactly what Moldova did. So they tracked down the illicit financing, they seized the funds, they cut off the means of transmission, they shut down or dismantled the organizations that were receiving this money, they arrested the people involved, and we saw the result. The result was a victory for democracy in Moldova. Now, Moscow lost that round, but that doesn't mean they're not still adapting and seeking ways to weaken the democratically government in Chisinau.
And in Hungary?
Oh, and in Hungary, in one case, you have a government that's not sort of pro-Russia trying to defend democracy. And in Hungary, you have sort of the flip side of that, where you have a pro-Russian government trying to stay in power. So it's a little, they have a little easier time doing that. What we're seeing in Hungary is Moscow is turning that election into a referendum on whether Budapest should be closer to the EU or Russia. And, if you talk to journalists in Hungary, they say the Russian embassy is basically a de facto campaign headquarters for Orban's party right now. And what's interesting is to see that, in Hungary, for the Fidesz party and Orban, George Soros, the pro-democracy, billionaire, was the great Satan, right? We're all talking about Iran lately, so he was their great Satan. Well, now Vladimir Zelensky is their great Satan. And so a lot of their disinformation is aimed at Ukraine, at Vladimir Zelensky. You saw all of the disinformation on this so-called money van, or the van full of gold, which was AI-created images of this gold and money in the van. I mean, a number of people have debunked it quite easily. But you're seeing all of that laundering its way through Hungarian language social media spaces. So, in Moldova, Moscow is trying to unseat a pro-Western EU-leaning government. And in Hungary, they're trying to keep a Russia-friendly government in place. So the method stays the same. Manipulate the climate, muddy the waters, and make Moscow's preferred candidate feel like the safest option.
Yeah, interesting. Hanna, faced with all of this, have the EU and NATO put the right policies in place for responding to hybrid warfare, or are they still kind of behind the curve reacting to events? I mean, to give you an example, the head of NATO's military committee, Admiral Cavadragone, caused some controversy late last year by calling for a more aggressive NATO response to drone incursions. Is that actually happening? Would it be more effective than a purely defensive approach?
I do believe that the approach is a little bit more aggressive, but I base that on the last weeks, actually, because it's been a very slow adaptation to identify and act on threats such as drones. As I said, it's been sometimes reported as accidents or just a coincidence, and they don't see the pattern. But I do see that the engagements increase, and especially when it comes to drones from the Shadow Fleet. And I participated in a military conference just a couple of weeks ago where we discussed the drone threat from the Shadow Fleet, because they do have drones aboard and how to handle that. And the mitigation strategies for drones in peacetime are limited. And that's a challenge. Most mitigation systems for drone handling are different type of shooting down drones or something like that. And that's weapon system. And you're not allowed to use that in peacetime in most open democratic countries. So we do have a bit of a space where it's not regulated clearly what we're supposed to do. We are too reactive at the moment. I personally, and this is a very personal view and subjective view from my perspective, think we should be more offensive in handling this situation, because at the moment we are waiting and investigating instead of actually doing something about this problem. We have a lack of methods and measures to handle drone interference, both in cities and over secure objects. So that's one of the big challenges to solve. And as the development, I don't know if you follow the development of drone technology just the last 1.5 years, it's developed rapidly because of AI. So I do believe that we need to have a bit of an AI scare at the moment, because what's coming next is going to be really hard for us to handle if we don't have a defense system that is able to create both mitigation strategies for handling large scale of attacks, because AI makes it possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Chris, what do you think? Why have the sort of number of reported drone incidents gone down in the last 3 months. So when, from the wave of them last year, is it the reporting that stopped, or is it, are there different tactics at work there?
First of all, I'd like to go back to the Admiral's comment. I think it says a lot that the idea of protecting European skies is controversial today. And it tells me that tells me where our mentality is, that we're still not there. Because if hostile actors can repeatedly probe our airspace, they can learn key lessons to defeat us in a potential conflict. So, I agree with Hanna, we need sharper responses. And I think we have had sharper responses. I think we have, they tested our air defenses, and we've shown that we will shoot them down, we will engage them, we will track them. And I think the Russians have learned some things from that. Now, maybe we don't see as many incidents now, or maybe they're not reported. I mean, I check the news now and then. You still see some reports here and there now and then, but I mean, I don't think it's the biggest scare in the news now, because we have a war in Iran and we have a number of other things happening. We had the whole scare over Greenland. So I think in some ways it's a combination of our response has been pretty effective, and there are other things sort of crowding it out of the news cycle.
Let me ask both of you this question, maybe Hanna first. Russia seems to be testing NATO's responses and also trying to unsettle our societies and make them distrust all politicians and all information, as Chris was saying earlier. Am I right in thinking that they're being quite successful in sowing mistrust, or are there other factors at work? I mean, is it just that our politics is not very good and deserves mistrust?
Russia has always been really good on building a disinformation and propaganda climate that's growing by itself. So when we see the landscape today, I would say that they are quite successful in the long run. It's not these tipping points where it's you could see a couple of years ago, something happens, was a lot of noise in social media and in media. Now it's more long-term, slow movement and pushing politics and pushing the agenda. I do believe that people are feeling worried at the moment. They are not feeling the trust they should feel. We are in an election year in Sweden. September 13 is the election in Sweden. And I do believe that they're going to push on the soft side of the citizens. I mean, the trust, the feeling, who can I trust? What can I trust in the system? Do we believe that this is the best way forward? How do we have a strong society? But at the same time, when I work with the authorities, the preparedness system, it's very unified, it's very well organized, and everybody works together. So hopefully this is going to spill over to society, so they feel that, okay, we have a plan, we are working to a more robust society.
Chris, how about you? Do you think the Russians are being quite successful in sowing mistrust, or are we managing to counter them?
I think it's partly true. Russia is good at if we have cracks in society, the Russians are good at widening those. They can amplify distrust, but I don't think they create it out of nothing. So I think, corruption, poor governance, economic anxiety, social media incentive structures, domestic political opportunism. These things all create that fertile ground upon which Russia can, and sometimes China, can bring their influence. And I think the danger we sometimes have is that we attribute too much agency to Moscow and don't look in the mirror ourselves. The more we can make our own democracies healthy and inclusive, the fewer cracks there are for Moscow to exploit.
Final thought from me, is that we too obviously have, over the decades, waged some forms of what you might call hybrid warfare against Russia. We have broadcast Western information through the BBC World Service, the Voice of America, Radio Liberty, and various other broadcasters. That was, during the Cold War, a lifeline for a lot of people who only had Soviet propaganda to go with otherwise. And since the internet era, obviously, we too have targeted Russian society and encouraged those and sponsored those in Russian society who were providing what we regard as free information rather than propaganda. Perhaps our ability to do so has been narrowed as Russia's become a more authoritarian society. society. But let's not forget that the Soviet Union was a very authoritarian society, and yet a lot of our information and news got through and was credible. That makes you wonder when you see that our governments, the two governments that were most in the lead on providing this kind of information support, the United States and the UK, are both cutting back on the funding or scrapping, in the case of the United States, the funding for these institutions which have been providing that lifeline information to people living under authoritarian rule for all this time. I'll leave it on that note. That's all we have time for this week. But you can find more to read on these topics on our website, www.epc.eu, including lots of interesting stuff on hybrid warfare by Chris. The Language of Power will be back in 2 weeks' time, when I'll be revisiting Europe's response to events in the Middle East and discussing the contest between values and interests in European foreign policy. Until then, thanks to my colleagues Simona Luswardi and Danilo Dugin for helping to organize and record this podcast, and thanks to you for listening in.